Good evening, you're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. Russia has ill intentions towards the whole world. This from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk as European ministers plan a drone wall along the eastern flank. More in just a moment. First, tonight's headlines. Moldova bars a pro-Russian party from the country's high-stakes parliamentary vote. Slovakia curbs the rights of same-sex couples. And Poland's government greenlights next year's budget despite high deficit levels. Defence ministers from across Europe have agreed to stand up a so-called drone wall along the continent's borders with Russia and Ukraine. It comes amid a growing list of aerial incursions impacting the likes of Poland, Romania and Denmark, with Russia largely accused of being behind them. And as Natalia Komarov reports, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has been quick to issue a sobering warning about the Kremlin's intent.
With the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk issuing a stark warning,
we must be really vigilant because Russia has bad intentions. Russia has bad intentions towards the entire free world.
European defense ministers held talks on Friday. The result? The Eastern Flank Watch, which will involve the creation of a drone wall.
We are facing clear challenges. Russia is testing the EU and NATO, and our response must be firm, united and immediate.
The talks were attended by representatives of Bulgaria, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland and Romania, as well as, contrary to previous reports, Hungary and Slovakia.
I think after the events in Copenhagen, at 4 airports in Denmark, we can see today that not only the eastern flank is threatened, the drones can be launched from a nearby ship just as well.
On Thursday night, unmanned aerial vehicles forced a temporary closure of Danish airports for the third time this week.
These are attacks that should shake us, as people and as a society.
While the Danish authorities have yet to identify the culprit behind the recent drone incursions, they do point to a state actor.
We do not have information that allows us to name an actor, but we can say that this looks like the model of hybrid warfare that we have seen elsewhere in Europe.
Similar airspace breaches have been reported this week by Norway and Sweden. Earlier this month, Poland and Romania also spotted foreign drones in their skies, and these two states possess proof that the incursions were executed by Moscow.
And I think the message here is clear. These are countries that are main supporters, main military aid providers for Ukraine.
Russia might be hoping that Europe won't focus as much on aiding Ukraine if it needs to spend on its own security.
And that's the thinking in Kremlin. If we can, do some hybrid warfare things in NATO countries in Europe, then they will stop support or lessen their support to Ukraine, and they keep their equipment, they keep their air defenses potentially to themselves.
But Moscow might be achieving the opposite effect. The more EU member states feel the threat, the more unified they become in countering Russia in any possible way.
The EU has woken up. The EU is investing in defense.
And, according to Prime Minister Tusk, it's high time, as the United States seems less and less interested in European security, recently announcing its plans to withdraw US troops from the Baltic states.
President Trump said that Ukraine, with the support of the EU, can recover all of its territory. This unexpected optimism foreshadows reduced US involvement and a shift in responsibility for ending the war to Europe. The truth is better than illusions.
For TVP World, Natalia Komarov.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is accusing Hungary of using spy drones to assess the country's border areas. In a separate incident, authorities say a drone was downed and detonated near the South Ukraine nuclear power plant overnight. Let's go live to Kyiv now on these developing stories where our correspondent Oz Chatterjee is standing by. Good evening, Oz. So what do we know about these two incidents?
Good evening. Well, if relations between Kiev and Hungary weren't bad enough, things have taken a bit of a turn over the course of the last 24 hours. First, we heard from President Zelensky following a meeting that he had with the Commander-in-Chief Syrski, and he gave his assessment on what they thought was a likely Hungarian incursion into Ukrainian airspace using reconnaissance drones. Let's take a listen to Zelensky's statement on the matter.
The commander-in-chief also reported on recent drone incidents along the Ukrainian-Hungarian border. Ukrainian forces recorded violations of our airspace by reconnaissance drones, which are likely Hungarian. Preliminary assessments suggest they may have been conducting reconnaissance on the industrial potential of Ukraine's border areas. I instructed that all available information be verified and that urgent reports be made on each recorded incident.
Now, it must be said that the Hungarians have responded, rejecting this accusation from Foreign Minister Peter Szijjártó this evening, saying President Zelensky is losing his mind to his anti-Hungarian obsession. He's now starting to see things that aren't there. And in response, Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha has also shot back, accusing the Hungarian government of hypocrisy, moral degradation, and serving as a Kremlin lackey. So clearly things are not well between Budapest and Kyiv. Things will hopefully not remain as difficult as they are, but we also understand that the European Union is making moves to circumvent the way Hungary has been blocking Ukrainian aid, for example. So not good in the terms of their relations currently. Now, in a separate incident, we also heard from the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, who said that a drone exploded some 800 meters away from the perimeter of the South Ukraine power plant. That's in the Mykolaiv region. Now, speaking in his statement, he said, once again, drones are flying far too close to nuclear power plants, putting nuclear safety at risk. Last night's incident did not result in any damage to the South Ukraine nuclear power plant itself. Next time, we may not be so lucky. So once again, another stark warning from the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency about the kinds of drone activity they have seen around Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Back to you, Aaron.
That's Oz Chatterjee in Kyiv. Thank you. Now, news breaking as we go to air tonight in Moldova, where the country's Central Electoral Commission has barred the pro-Russian Heart of Moldova party just 2 days out from a high-stakes election this weekend. Our Balkans correspondent Pavel Chaskovsky has just touched down in Chisinau. Good evening, Pavel. What was the reason behind this decision?
Illegal financing of political campaign, Aaron. Not alleged, mind you, but reported and documented by the Central Electoral Commission, the very commission that also cancelled the registration of members of Heart of Moldova as candidates for MPs in the Sunday's vote. Now, to understand the implications of this decision, we have to take a broader look at Moldovan politics. Currently, the country is being governed by the pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity, and for the past 4 years, the country has governed independently and has kept Moldova on a steady path towards EU accession. However, over this time, the support for PAS, Party of Action and Solidarity, has dwindled, and now they have a major contender in a form of the so-called Patriotic Bloc. Now, the Patriotic Bloc is a coalition of 4 socialist and communist parties, among them Heart of Moldova, and as we know, as we already mentioned, the members of Heart of Moldova can no longer participate in the Sunday's ballot. However, the remaining 3 parties still can take part in the race, and it will be a highly contested race. Because if you look at the polls, you will see that the Party of Action and Solidarity, if you look at the polls that include the Moldovan diaspora, which is large, the Party of Action and Solidarity is leading in the polls ahead of the Patriotic Bloc. But if you look at the polls that show only the domestic voters, then you will notice that the Patriotic Bloc has a small lead. All in all, neither of these parties is projected to be able to govern independently, and most likely they will have to form a coalition with one of the smaller parties that are also expected to join the parliament, and they will form a coalition that should take Moldova to the European Union, as Moldova plans to join the bloc by 2030. Please listen.
I don't think it's fair to say that's it, done and over, because if the non-EU forces come to power, they're not going to have a huge majority anyway. I think it's going to be very, very slim, no matter the result. And to be honest, over the past 2 or 3 years since Moldova became an EU candidate country, they've done so many reforms. They've reformed institutions, they've kind of installed democratic bodies, they've improved anti-corruption, you name it, they've done it. So you can't really sweep all of those reforms away overnight. A lot of it really depends on how the EU responds to the result. If Maia Sandu's party, if PAS, doesn't win, and if the electoral result seems legitimate and fair, I'm not quite sure what the EU is going to do, because they've got to work with the country somehow.
But Moldova's EU accession bid is constantly being disrupted by Russia. Last year, during the country's presidential election and EU accession referendum, almost 10% of all the votes cast were bought with Russian money. And we are talking only about outright corruption and not mentioning the votes that were swayed by Russian disinformation and propaganda. And early reports indicate that Russian efforts to disrupt the electoral process in Moldova this time round are even stronger. Aaron, back to you.
Paweł Trzaskowski in Moldova, thank you. Slovakian law will now take precedence over the European Union on matters of national identity. That's according to an amendment to the country's constitution, which passed through Parliament on Friday. The regulations cover marriage, gender and adoption, and are being described by some as a move towards Russian-style legislation. Kazimierz Swisek reports.
And just like that, the Slovakian parliament voted through the amendment to the constitution on national identity on Friday. Some of the changes include recognizing only 2 genders, male and female, and banning single parents from adopting children. The opposition is furious.
It's trying to take Slovakia out of EU and into, I would say, model of Belarus. So kind of a not really democracy, but a country under strong influence of Putin and his regime. You can see that also by who Fico is recently meeting.
Prime Minister Robert Fico, an ally of Russian leader Vladimir Putin, has been taking Slovakia on an increasingly anti-EU course since the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Mimicking the style of US President Donald Trump, Fico sees anything other than traditional family values as a threat.
Slovakia today said a clear no to progressive experimentation and yes to normality.
These latest changes are likely to raise eyebrows among international human rights observers.
Something that they called kind of national identity, and very vague formulation that the Venice Commission recently has expressed serious concern that these are reminiscent of the changes in Hungary and Russia.
Legal analysts point to the vagueness of this phrasing as a potential problem in the future. While the matters of family, gender and adoption fall under domestic law of EU member states, the ambiguity of some of the wording leaves room for government overreach.
It's a matter of of interpretation, how this matter will be interpreted by the top tribunals in Slovakia.
Slovakia and Hungary are two EU members that have recently come under criticism from Washington for purchasing large amounts of Russian oil and gas, fueling Putin's war machine in Ukraine. The amendment on national identity won't do Bratislava any favors in the EU either, especially given the black sheep reputation it already has. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
Poland's government has granted the green light to the country's budget for next year, with military and defence spending top of mind. But despite expectations of economic growth, concerns are rising over deficit levels, which are already among the highest in the EU. Maciej Wilowski has more.
Poland's government has approved its draft budget for next year, outlining its spending plan and projections for economic growth. The Finance Ministry projects gross domestic product will expand 3.5% next year, similar to this year's forecast of 3.4%. That's in line with the latest estimates released by PKO BP, Poland's largest bank. The bank also expects up to 4 rate cuts next year as inflation moderates toward the central bank's target of 2.5%. Analysts at Warsaw's Velo Bank have similar expectations.
Poland is in a situation of a Goldilocks economy. So we're going to go through moderate growth. So from the perspective of Western Europe, 3.5 is high. From the perspective of historical values for Poland, that is moderate.
Moderate may become the new norm as wages rise and the Polish economy becomes more advanced.
Our historical growth is not a good benchmark to what's ahead.
Despite its solid growth projections, the new budget raises concerns about rising deficits and debt. As a share of GDP, Poland's budget deficit is the second highest in the EU behind Romania, driven by a surge in military and defense spending in recent years. Next year's deficit is projected at 6.5% of GDP. That's more than double the 3% limit imposed under the EU's excessive deficit procedure. Public debt is also on an upward trajectory, likely hitting 60% of GDP by the end of this year. If left unchecked, rising debt and deficits could cause investors to lose confidence in the country's finances, triggering a sell-off in government bonds.
The fiscal situation is something deeply watched by investors buying Polish bonds, those who are investing in Poland. So this is one of those things that so fiscal is not an issue up until it becomes an issue.
Credit rating agencies could also take notice. Last Friday, Moody's changed the outlook on Poland's debt to negative. The credit rating itself was left unchanged for now. While the Polish economy remains stable and growing, rising debt and deficits could derail that growth if left unchecked. For TVP World, I'm Maciej Wilowski.
History on Mount Everest for a Polish climber who's become the first person in the world to descend from Earth's highest peak on skis and without extra oxygen. The athlete spent only a few minutes at the top of the mountain before taking 2 days to return to base camp. Ovidio Szniczea reports.
Skiing from the top of the world is something very few have ever dared to undertake. And until now, no one had skied down Mount Everest without bottled oxygen. Pole Andrzej Bargiel is the first person ever to complete this extraordinary feat.
I wanted to do this for years. I spent 3 months in a tent at the foot of Mount Everest. You need determination to achieve feats like these. Skiing down that peak was a great adventure. It really is a massive mountain, and you become even more aware of its size at this time of year because there's no one else there.
But skiing down was not the only challenge. Getting to the summit in these conditions and without supplementary oxygen required extreme athletic stamina and mental strength. Bargiel spent 16 hours climbing up the so-called death zone, located at over 8,000 meters above sea level, where breathing is nearly impossible.
Only 1.8% of summits were ever achieved without the use of supplemental oxygen. To be able to do this in the autumn climbing season, when we're the only expedition here and you have to set the route, you have to fix the route with the Sherpas and actually find the route to the summit in deep snow without any oxygen, I think it's completely remarkable.
preparations for the historic descent took weeks, and for Andrzej Bargiel, it took an entire lifetime to gear up for the challenge. That's why after the success, Bargiel's team was bursting with pride and elation. After all, the momentous achievement was not a piece of cake.
You need a lot of experience. I'm 37, and it would have been a difficult thing for me to do earlier in life. You need to be completely independent in the mountains, understand the risks, but also take care of your own safety and surround yourself with the right people.
Andrzej Bargiel's story is one of perseverance. His previous Everest expeditions in 2019 and 2022 were cut short by weather conditions. But the third time really was the charm for Bargiel, whose breathtaking accomplishment will now be chronicled in a documentary, scheduled for release in 2026. For TVP World, Ovidiusz Nicieja.
We return now to our top story, Russia's hybrid threats and NATO's proposed drone wall. And joining me for more is Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, he says Russia has ill intentions towards the whole world. Is he right?
Well, Vladimir Putin seems to be lashing out against the West and attempting to restore the Russian Empire. Recently, the drone attacks against Poland, sabotage against Europe in general, and the overflight of Estonia suggests that Trump is trying to intimidate Europe and search for weak points. This has generated a reaction from the Europeans and maybe from the Trump administration. I think Putin's arrogance could be a problem for him because so far the Europeans are not acting cowed.
Tell me then, what should we read into these airspace violations, these drone incursions in recent weeks, on top of, as you mentioned quite rightly there, the alleged sabotage incidents backed by Russia? I mean, is Moscow already at war with the West?
I wouldn't say that Russia is at war with the West. I think they are hostile and they are engaged in probing for political weakness and probing maybe for military weakness as well. Some pro-Moscow commentators in the West have suggested that the Russians intend to warn the West against any kind of reassurance force. That's possible, but it also suggests that Russia intends still to conquer Ukraine and to intimidate the West into allowing this to happen. I don't think the West, at least not the Europeans, will permit this.
On the back of these incursions into airspace, we're now seeing NATO act, rolling out the likes of the Eastern Sentry mission, standing up this drone wall. But in your view, the fact that this is all happening after Russia's incursion, does that tell us that the alliance has been a little bit asleep at the wheel as to what Russia is capable of on the eastern flank?
I think that Europeans have had to wake up to the fact that Russia really is a threat to their security. But I think that this process of realizing that Russia is not merely misunderstood, it is hostile, is, if not complete, I think it is past a turning point. I think the Germans now have abandoned their previous hopes for endless accommodation of Russia. I think that NATO's response to the drone incursion against Poland was actually adequate. That is, it wasn't simply Polish fighters in the air, it was also Italian AWACS, German Patriots, and Dutch fighters. So I think that the NATO response has been all right. I think that NATO needs to step up its air patrols, and I also think it should consider quite seriously defending forward inside Ukraine, that is, in Ukrainian airspace. If Russia is going to use drones to cross Ukraine and move into Poland, there is no reason that NATO needs to wait for the incursion to take place. It can defend forward from inside Ukraine.
Now, Russia's threats, of course, not just from the air, but its circle of influence is also entrenched across the region. Briefly on Moldova, while I have you, we've had a story in the programme, of course, Moldova going to the polls on Sunday and facing up to these vast allegations of Russian interference, disinformation. We've had some news breaking tonight that one of the pro-Russian parties has been removed from the vote. How crucial are these ballots through Central and Eastern Europe, not just for, say, Moldova, but for European security as a whole?
This isn't a new story. We know perfectly well that Russia has attempted to interfere in European elections, both EU member states and countries like Moldova that are outside the EU. Russia wants its empire back. This is not a hard one to figure out. And Poles need no American to tell them this. They already know. Russia wants the empire back. They will employ a variety of tactics to get it back, including election interference, threats, intimidations, sabotage, as has turned out, and even war in the case of Georgia and Ukraine. Putin is serious. We must take him seriously. Our response needs to be strong and sustained. We need to push back on Russian attempts at aggression of all kinds against its European neighbors. And we need to increase the pressure on Russia, both economically, politically, and even militarily, in the sense of arming Ukraine, so that Putin realizes he'd better make a settlement rather than keep pushing.
Now, in July, Donald Trump announced weapons for Ukraine through NATO and that 50-day sanctions deadline for Putin. You wrote in Time magazine at the time, Putin's arrogance in wanting total Ukrainian surrender could prove his downfall if only Trump sticks to his position. What do you make of his comments this week that Kyiv could completely take back lost land? Is his position changing here? And is he, in fact, as some say, shifting responsibility and blame for Ukraine on European shoulders?
Well, there are two contradictory interpretations of Trump's words out there. One is that Trump is very forward-leaning and that these strong words may be a prelude to strong policy. I hope so. But there is the alternative view that behind Trump's more optimistic assessment of the battlefield is an attempt to back the United States out of support for Ukraine and force Europeans to take even more responsibility for the problem. I suspect what is happening is that the Trump administration is badly divided, with different circles arguing in different directions. I think some in the Trump administration, perhaps Marco Rubio, certainly General Kellogg, are pushing for support of Ukraine on kind of Reaganite grounds. Others are arguing for a U.S. withdrawal from Ukraine and even a lowering of commitment to Europe for reasons both neo-isolationist or Asia first. I think we will discover that within the Trump administration, there were competing and mutually antagonistic factions making different arguments. In this context, I think the Polish role is important. Poland has standing in Trump world. Poland in general and President Nawrocki in particular. Of course, Foreign Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Radek Sikorski knows the Americans well. He's also a person of the right. He has great knowledge of the American scene. So between President Nawrocki and Deputy Prime Minister Sikorski, both the presidency and the government in Poland are well poised to work with the Trump administration and work with Trump world. And I hope that they do so. I thought that Sikorski and Nawrocki were speaking more or less the same language in New York this past week. That's a good sign. But this struggle within the Trump administration, whether to support Ukraine or not, or if so, how much, is something that is of great concern to Poland, and Poland can play a constructive role, and I think is.
So you're saying Poland could be a game changer in ensuring that President Trump does not give up on Ukraine?
Well, I don't want to put too much of the responsibility on Poland's shoulders. Game changer is awfully strong, but Poland can have influence. Poland is spending serious money on defense. Poland is seen as a conservative society. the Polish president is supported by MAGA World and by President Trump. So Poland's word carries some weight, and I think that this is an opportunity for Poland to act in a way that is helpful to the cause of the free world generally.
Now, we're running out of time, but a brief last question. I spoke to NATO's former chief spokesperson, Oana Lungescu, a few weeks ago, and she agreed that the alliance has been facing its moment of truth. Are we in a world where we're getting closer to some kind of an Article 5, where NATO, including Washington, will need to respond with force or risk looking toothless?
I think this possibility is real. I think that NATO's leadership is perfectly well aware of this. The signals from the Trump administration are mixed, but much better than they were, let's say, 6 months ago. I think that if we show sufficient resolve now, Putin will back off. But the burden is on us to show resolve to his continued provocations.
Daniel Fried, former US ambassador to Poland. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all for World News tonight. But don't go anywhere. Face to Face with Michał Broniatowski and Adam Yasser is next. I'm Aaron Darman. Good night.